Hi, everybody. We are going to read chapter 7 of Shaking the Nickel Bush, and the house is quiet because Malcolm's playing Xbox with a dog. Hi, dog. So, chapter 7 is called Shiftless. I found a bum who was glad to make a quarter by helping me carry our new outfits to the hotel. But when we got there, Lonnie hadn't come in, and it was nearly 7 o'clock. I laid each outfit separately on the bed with the saddles on the folded blankets. That was a dog sneeze. But I put the Navajo under Lonnie's saddle instead of mine. Then I left the lamp lit when I went to the restaurant to see if he'd been there to eat. He hadn't, so I went on out to the garage. A couple of lanterns were sitting on the floor by Shiftless's front wheels, and both Joe and Lonnie were underneath. There were greasy nuts, bolts, and odd parts lying all around underneath them. But they were so busy arguing that they didn't hear me come in. I stooped down just as Joe shouted, "There ain't no need of hauling the engine, I tell you. Them main bearin's ain't so bad I can fix 'em right up where they're at. Shim 'em up a mite and pour on some hot Babbitt, they'll be as good as new." I didn't want Lonnie to find me there and think I was snooping, so I asked, "What is it, all shot to the dickens, Lonnie?" He rolled his face toward me, and his eyes looked as though he were peeking through holes in a black rag. "No, buddy," he said. "Honest, it ain't bad. It's only the bearin's. A bolt come loose in the oil pan, and some fool run it after the oil had all leaked out." Joe seemed to think Lonnie needed a little help. He reached up above his face, grabbed hold of something, and jiggled it. It sounded like a handful of stones being shaken in a bucket. "Ain't scarcely no playin' 'em at all," he shouted. "Like I was tellin' Lonnie, all them main bearin's need is a shot of hot lead. Come mornin', so'st I can see to get at 'em, I didn't have the slightest idea what Joe had hold of, but I did remember a few of the questions Mr. Larson asked me, so I broke in. "What's that you got a hold of, the crankshaft?" Yep, he called back. "Ain't scarcely no play at all in it." "Is it worn egg-shaped?" I asked. "Not enough to mount to nothin'," he shouted. "You won't notice it none after I get some hot Babbitt poured round 'em." I didn't want to go any further till I'd talked to Mr. Larson some more, so I broke in. "Come on, Lonnie. It's about time for the restaurant to close. If we're going to get any supper, you'd better start cleaning up." All the way downtown, Lonnie kept telling me there was nothing wrong with the flivver that he couldn't fix the next day, and the more he talked, the more I realized how badly we'd been stuck. The restaurant was already closed when we got there, but Mr. Larson unlocked the door and let us in. Then while Mrs. Larson was in the kitchen cooking our supper, he and Lonnie talked about Shiftless. As far as I was concerned, they might as well have been talking Choctaw. It was all about camshafts and piston rings and carburetors and differentials and a lot of other things I'd never heard of. After a while, I got tired of it and went out to talk to Mrs. Larson till supper was ready. Lonnie didn't say 3 words while we were eating, and when we'd finished, Mr. Larson beckoned for me to come to the kitchen. He whispered to me that Lonnie knew we'd been stuck, but wouldn't listen to reason when he'd suggested that we take our loss and sell the car back to the garage man. "I'm not surprised at that," I told him. "For some crazy reason, he seems to have fallen in love with that old rattletrap." Mr. Larson hunched his shoulders and spread his hands. Then he smiled and said, "Maybe you're not too bad off. He knows more about engines than I'd expected, and if he loves that old flivver, he'll nurse it. I've advised him to tear the motor right down to the block and replace every worn part. It's risky business to drive into the backcountry with a bum engine." "Did he say he'd do it?" I asked. Mr. Larson spread his hands and said, "Just froze up and wouldn't talk." I think Lonnie was afraid of what Mr. Larson might have told me. All the way to our room he walked along with his head down, and I couldn't get 2 words out of him. I unlocked the door and held it back for him to go in. He took 2 steps, then stopped as if someone had been in there pointing a gun at him. For fully a minute he stood looking at the outfits as if he couldn't believe what he saw. He didn't move until I said, "The one on the far side is yours. This one of mine wouldn't be big enough for you to get your fat butt into." Lonnie made it to the bed in a single leap, dropped to his knees, and rubbed his hands over the smooth leather, across the Navajo blanket, and along one leg of the chaps. When he looked up at me, his eyes were swimming. Then he looked back at the saddle and said, "Honest to God, buddy, honest to God. You'll never be sorry you done it. I'll never leave you down. I'll give you every dime out of my paychecks till—" I never would have guessed that Lonnie could bawl about anything, but he seemed on the verge of it, so I said, "You wait here a few minutes. I'm going over to the livery stable and get some saddle soap. I don't have an idea these old hulls have been soaped up since they lit in that hawk shop." It was midnight before I could get Lonnie to stop working on his saddle, and he wouldn't have stopped then if I hadn't reminded him that he had a big job ahead of him the next day. By that time, I'd known Lonnie two days. By the time I'd known Lonnie 2 days, I'd come to the conclusion that the hardest job he ever did was wake up in the morning. Most cowhands are wide awake the moment they open their eyes, and unless they've been on night herd, they will usually open them at the first crack of dawn. But not Lonnie. He could have slept with a stampeding herd all around him, and no matter if he turned in at sundown, he'd sleep through till noon unless someone shook the tar out of him. Even after I'd get him on his feet, he'd still be more than half asleep, and it would often take him as much as an hour to get out of low gear. When the morning after we got our outfits, he shook me long before daylight, I thought the hotel must be afire. I flung the covers back and started to jump out of bed, but Lonnie whispered, "Take it easy, buddy. There ain't no sense of you rolling out for another couple of hours. It ain't much after 5, but if I'm going to get Shiftless fixed up and ready by nightfall, I'd best be getting at her." That was the first time Lonnie ever called the old flivver Shiftless, and for a couple of seconds I didn't know what he was talking about. Then when the cobwebs cleared away, I said, "You're out of your head, Lonnie. Joe won't have his garage open at this time in the morning, and besides, there's no sense in going out there till you've had your breakfast. The restaurant doesn't open till 6. "I don't want no breakfast," he told me. "I'll go on out to the garage so's to be there when Joe opens up. And look, buddy, when you go over to breakfast, don't let that Swede talk no foolish notions into your head. He don't know nothin' about automobiles. Leastway, not about flivvers that have been wore a bit and have to be fixed up some." "Oh, I thought he did," I said. "He told me we weren't too bad off with Shiftless, and that you knew a lot more about autos than he'd expected." For a minute Lonnie stood there beside the bed with his mouth hanging open, and then his face lighted up gradually, just as a mountaintop does when that morning sun first touches it. "Jeepers," he said, "maybe that old Swede knows more than I reckoned on. You know, come to think of it, I believe I could go for a bite of breakfast. We could finish soaping up our outfits while we're waiting for the joint to open." Lonnie and I were waiting when Mr. and Mrs. Larson came to open the restaurant, and we were there till nearly time for Joe to open his garage at 8 o'clock. Of course, we weren't the only customers, but Mr. Larson told us to come back to the kitchen, and he talked to Lonnie as he fried eggs and sausages. Every now and then his face was turned my way, and he'd let one eyelid droop. There wasn't a cotter, pin, nut, bolt, or gear in a Ford that he didn't know about, and he must have mentioned every one of them and told Lonnie to check it. But the thing he kept harping on was that we shouldn't try to hurry too much, and that every moving part that was worn should be replaced. When we left, Lonnie wasn't calling him the Swede anymore, but Helgar. "Know what we're going to do first thing, buddy?" Lonnie asked as we left the restaurant. "We're going to pull that daggone engine, that's what we're going to do. Like Helgar says, how's a man to know them crankshaft bearings ain't egg-shaped less'n he gets 'em out where he can put a pair of calipers on 'em?" Joe was mad as the dickens when Lonnie told him we were going to pull the engine out of Shiftless. He shouted and yelled and told us we were a pair of fools. "I ain't going to waste my time on no such nonsense," he hollered at me. "All that little car needs is a shot of hot lead here and there, just enough to tighten up them loose bearin's, and it would run like a rabbit." Sure, I said I'd lend a hand and furnish the spare parts, and I would for any reasonable sort of a job, but if you go to hauling that engine all to pieces, I'll have to charge you for 'em. It took Lonnie and me all day to get the engine out and taken to pieces, and I didn't need to be a mechanic to know why Joe didn't want us to do it. The cylinder walls were worn a 1/4 inch bigger around the pistons, and were scored so badly they looked as if a wildcat had scratched them. Every bearing was melted out, and the valve stems were burned half in two. The combustion chambers were plugged with rock-hard carbon, and there wasn't a shaft anywhere that wasn't worn lopsided. But by quitting time, we had nuts, bolts, and entrails scattered all over the floor, and a list 6 inches long of parts we'd need for making the repairs. The next forenoon we found a 1914 Ford in a junkyard, and it was exactly what we needed. When it was almost new, it had been hit by a train and smashed to smithereens, but the only trouble with the engine was that the cylinder block had been cracked and the magneto ruined. After a little haggling, we bought whatever parts we wanted to take out of it for $10. By borrowing a lantern from Mr. Larson and tools from Joe, we'd stripped out everything worth taking by midnight, and I'd learned quite a bit about the inside of a Ford engine. Before we started, Mr. Larson had told us not to take bushings, bearings, valves, rings, and gaskets, because we'd always have trouble if we tried to reuse them, and that it was cheaper to buy new. But they weren't very cheap at that. In the 4 days it took us to put that engine back together, the money leaked out of my pocket as if it had been water. The first list of parts we bought at the auto supply store cost more than $23, and I had to pay Joe about half that much in quarters and half dollars for the little things we'd forgotten to put on the list. Even at 35 cents apiece, our meals had amounted to nearly $15. The groceries I'd promised the doctor would take along had cost $14.10, and the hotel had gone up half $1 a day on my rent when Lonnie moved in. Mr. Larson knew I was worried, but he kept telling me we'd only make trouble for ourselves by cutting corners or hurrying, so we scraped every bearing to a tight fit, ground the valves till they shone like glass, and made sure that everything fitted snugly before we put it back together. With each new piece we put into place, the crankshaft turned harder until finally it wouldn't turn at all. but Lonnie said not to worry about it, that it would work all right when the engine was filled with oil. It was almost closing time on Friday night when we got the engine back into shiftless, a gallon of oil in the crankcase, and the tank filled with gasoline. Lonnie was too excited to keep quiet. While I was paying Joe for the gas and oil, he climbed in behind the steering wheel and shouted, "Twist her tail, buddy, wind her up tight, and don't get scared when she starts up with a roar. I'll cool her right down with the throttle." I engaged the crank handle and jerked up on it with all my might, but the engine wouldn't turn an inch. "You know what, buddy?" Lonnie called. "We might have got a couple of them bearin's a smidgen too tight." "Well, that don't make no never-minds. They'll loosen right up. Times the engine's been turned over a few times. Oh, Joe, how about giving us a little pull with your truck?" "Well," Joe said with a broad grin, "I reckon it could be took care of after we get settled up. The way I figure it, you boys owe me $50 for the work I done that first day, along with the use of my garage and tools. You can have the car when I get the 50. I had to hold Lonnie to keep him from going after Joe with his fists, but I knew that fighting would only get him arrested. So I told him, "There's only one way to do business with a crook, Lonnie, and that's through a lawyer. Let's go see Mr. Larson." Joe laughed as though he'd never heard anything so funny. "That's the ticket," he told me. "Go crack your whip and listen to the noise it makes." Our whip didn't make much noise. Mr. Larson phoned a lawyer, but when he was through talking, he told us there isn't much he can do beyond trying to get the bill cut down, and he still can't do that till morning. If he took the case to court, it would cost you a lot of time and money, and you'd probably lose anyway. I didn't sleep worth a dime that night. As near as I could figure, Shiftless had already cost me over $150, counting in meals and room rent while we were fixing her up, and another $50 would leave me in a bad way. I'd had to take one $50 bill out of the cuff of my breeches when I bought our outfits, and another before we were through buying parts, and there was only $13.90 of it left. After Lonnie went to sleep, I took out the third $50 and put it in my pocket, but I made up my mind that I'd sell our outfits or Shiftless or anything else we had before I'd spend the last one. After writing Mother the big yarns I had about my fine job and sending her $50 every month, I couldn't write and tell her a bunch of different lies. I'd just keep right on with the story I'd begun, and I'd send her $50 a month just as long as I could get hold of it without stealing. But if we didn't get out of Phoenix pretty quick, it looked as though that time wasn't far ahead. The next morning, each hour dragged like a week because there was nothing we could do but sit around Larson's restaurant and wait for a phone call from the lawyer. I'd have forgotten all about the doctor if Mr. Larson hadn't reminded me that it was a week since I'd been to see him, and that I'd better get a report sent off before we left town. I did, and it cost $2. It was after 10 o'clock when the call came. Mr. Larson answered the phone and said the lawyer wanted to talk to me. His voice sounded as if he were an old gentleman and a kindly one. He said he had been out to talk to Joe, and though there was no doubt advantage was being taken of us, the best he had been able to do was get the bill reduced to $35, but that included getting the engine started and running. When I asked him what we owed him, he said there would be no charge, and that he had done it as a favor to Mr. Larson. When we got out to the garage, Joe had Shiftless chained to the back of his truck and was as pleasant as if we'd never had a bit of trouble. With all them new bearin's and bushings and piston rings, she's likely to pull a mite stiff till the oil gets worked in good round 'em, he told Lonnie. Might take 2-3 turns around the block before she gets limbered up and running good, but that's all right with me. I won't make you no charge for my time, nor for the gas it takes neither. Just hold her in neutral till I get you out on a straightaway into rollin' good, then leave her into high gradual, and fish around a mite with the spark. If she don't take right holt and go firing in high, kick her into low. That'll fetch her round in a hurry. I climbed in beside Lonnie, and he was excited as a little boy at a carnival when Joe pulled us out of the garage. We started at a crawl, and every couple of feet Lonnie turned the wheel a little to one side or the other, but I couldn't see that it made any difference. Shiftless seemed to have her own ideas about where she wanted to go, and wandered a little from side to side like a cow following a crooked path through a pasture. The more Joe picked up speed, the more Shiftless wandered. When Lonnie let the clutch pedal up, Shiftless sort of hunkered for a fraction of a second, like a horse getting set for a buck jump. Then I thought she was going to sunfish instead. Her hind end skewed around, and from under the floorboards there was a shriek that sounded as if we'd run over a hog. Shiftless bucked and switched her tail for a few lengths and began bouncing, sort of like a little girl skipping down a sidewalk. After 100 yards or so, the skipping smoothed out, and I could tell the engine was turning over, but no matter how much Lonnie jiggled the spark and gas levers, Shiftless never fired a shot. After Joe had pulled us around the block a couple of times, he stopped his truck, came back, took the engine hood off, and fiddled with the ignition wires a minute or two. Then he looked up at me and said, "Now, wouldn't that frost your eyeballs? This magneto has went deader'n a dodo. But that won't make no difference to you. It'll build right up again soon's you've driven it a few miles. All you need is a hotshot battery to have it started off with, and I've got an old one I'd leave you have for 50 cents. The hotshot battery was all we needed to get the engine started. As soon as Joe wired it up, he pulled us again, and Lonnie had barely let the clutch pedal up before the engine backfired a couple of times and started with a roar. Old Shiftless acted as happy as I felt and put on a shimmy dance that nearly rattled my teeth loose. The minute the engine started, Joe stopped his truck and came back again. He didn't pay any attention to Lonnie, but above the roaring, rattling, and backfiring, he shouted to me, "There she is, running like a top, 35 and she's yours." Lonnie couldn't get the chain unhitched fast enough to suit him, and by the time I'd paid Joe, he was back behind the wheel. He didn't wait for Joe to pull his truck out of the way, but backed shiftless a few yards, reversed, and went around the old truck as if he'd been heading for a fire. As far as I could tell, the engine didn't have any knocks in it, but it would have been hard to hear a blacksmith's hammering above the rattle of the doors and fenders. Joe had folded the engine hood when he took it off and tossed it into the back seat. The sides were slapping together like cymbals in a jazz band, and every few seconds the exhaust would backfire as though a sheriff's posse were after us. Lonnie's face was beaming, and above the noise he yelled, "Got to expect a little backfire until she gets warmed up. Listen to that engine, buddy. Ain't she sweet? I'll just take her a turn down the road till I get used to the feel of her." Warming up didn't do much for the backfiring. By the time Lonnie had driven a quarter of a mile, a wisp of steam was shooting out of the radiator cap, and by the time he'd gone a half mile, anybody might have thought we were driving Old Faithful. But Shiftless was backfiring as much as ever. Lonnie slowed to 10 miles an hour, and we went down the street to Larson's, sounding as if we were celebrating the 4th of July. I don't know how we'd have got out of Phoenix without the Larsons, and I hate to think what might have happened to us afterwards. As soon as we drew up in front of the restaurant, Mr. Larson came out to meet us. He didn't say anything about the geyser that was shooting up from Shiftless's radiator or the firecrackers that were shooting out of her exhaust pipe. He leaned over the engine, put an ear down toward it, and told Lonnie he'd done a fine job on the bearings. "Bound to heat up till they get worn a bit," he said. "Want to borrow my hose to set a trickle of water running through the radiator?" As he said it, he reached down and moved the spark rod back to the retarded position. The backfiring stopped, and the exhaust sounded like the feet of a galloping pony. Nice job, Mr. Larson said as he listened to it, hitting on all four. While he listened, he turned the adjustment screws on the carburetor a trifle, and the sound of the exhaust changed to the steady 4-beat rhythm of a trot. "This needlepoint is in good shape," he told Lonnie. "Honed it, didn't you?" I'd never heard Lonnie say "sir" to anyone, and I had to be careful not to grin when he said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Larson. I honed it right to a fine point like you told me, and I leveled them distributor points with a platinum file. If you'd tell me where your hose is at, I'd go get it." When Lonnie had started away for the hose, Mr. Larson winked at me and said, "You'll be all right. He'll take care of it, and he learns quick. He hasn't wanted you to know it, but he's been pestering me with questions all week. Don't let him advance the spark more than half an inch when you crank it. The timing gears are set a bit forward, and it might kick your head off. You'll get a spark knock on the hills, but don't let that worry you. It won't hurt anything. Decided yet where you're going to head for?" "Lonnie's been talking about going east toward Globe," I told him. "That's all right," he said, "but go much further east and you'll run into Indian Reservation. You wouldn't do any good there, and if you turn north toward Flagstaff, you'll run into mountain country. Thought about following the Gila? The river has some pretty good ranches along it, and the weather's warmer down that way if you want to get lots of sun on you." "Does the railroad follow the Gila?" I asked. "Most of the way," he said, "and there are towns all along it, so you'd have no trouble finding a doctor and sending in your report every week. Here comes Lonnie. I'd let him idle the engine and run water through the radiator an hour before I started out if I were you, and I'd take along some extra. A tight Ford is apt to boil away a lot of water in the desert." It was well after noon before we got away from the Larsons, and anyone might have thought we were their own sons. Mr. Larson went all over the engine with Lonnie, answering questions and showing him how to adjust the carburetor and the condenser points and the distributor. Then he helped him fix a rack on one of the running boards and load it with our groceries and extra gas and water. While Mr. Larson worked with Lonnie, I did what I could to help Mrs. Larson with the few customers they had. I waited on the counter while she did the cooking and dished up the orders, but in between she was scurrying around like a squirrel getting ready for winter, packing an orange crate with the things for us to take along. She filled one side of the crate solid with food, 4 big loaves of gluten bread, nearly half a baked ham that she said was for Lonnie, a quart jar of stewed chicken for me, coffee, condensed milk, onions, potatoes, carrots, and half a dozen bunches of celery. In the other side of the crate she'd packed a frying pan, coffee pot, dishpan, butcher knife, a couple of cups, plates, knives, forks, and spoons of different sizes. Then she gave me a black iron pot about 10 inches across and 5 inches high, with a heavy iron lid that had an inch-high rim. Except for a pint jar in the center, the pot was packed tight with dish towels. "That's your sourdough," Mrs. Larson told me as she showed me the jar. "You won't find many ranch cooks who can make you gluten bread that's fit to eat, but there's no reason you can't make it for yourself. That recipe of your mother's is fine, only it needs a few caraway seeds to make the bread tasty, and you'll have to use sourdough in place of store yeast because you can't count on finding yeast at a ranch cookhouse." Every time I'd come back with dirty dishes, Mrs. Larson would catch me and tell me things I'd need to know. How I'd have to keep the sourdough jar not too warm and not too cool. How to add a bit of grated raw potato, flour, and warm water each time I used any so as to keep the starter alive and fermenting. Then she explained how to mix my dough in the dishpan and bake it in the Dutch oven pot, clearing a place for it at the center of a burned-down campfire, filling the lid with live coals, and then heaping others around the sides and covering the whole thing with sod or hot ashes. She said we could roast chickens in it in the same way or use it for making stews. When we pulled away from the restaurant, the Larsons were standing on the sidewalk waving to us, and they hadn't let me pay them a penny for anything. We stopped only a few minutes at the hotel, just long enough for me to pay what was due on our room and to carry out our bedrolls and outfits. I was going to throw away the bucket of clay I'd been playing with for the week I was laid up, and the sticks and wires I'd used for armatures, but there wasn't any place I could throw them easily, so I just set them in the back end of Shiftless along with the rest of our stuff. And that is the end of Chapter 7. Bye-bye.